Good afternoon, all, and thank you for joining us in our 2024 complimentary webinar series covering the FAR, or Federal Acquisition Regulations. We're coming to you live today from Washington, D.C. Thank you for being here. Okay, so just a little bit about the series. As usual, all of our webinars are complimentary and recorded. The FAR has 52 total parts, and we'll run through them sequentially each week on Wednesdays and Fridays at noon Eastern Time. The recordings and the PowerPoints will be posted within 24 hours of the webinar ending, and you can find all of these recordings on our YouTube channel simply by subscribing to it or using the link you see on the screen. There's no cost for this. You can find the PowerPoint on the SlideShare site using your links and credentials to log in, and there's no cost for this either. We also offer sponsorship opportunities, so if you're interested in that, please shoot us an email to hello@jenniferschaus.com. So how to sign up for the series? Unfortunately, there's no bulk registration, so you do have to register individually for each webinar. But if you go to the Jennifer Schaus website, navigate to the section called the FAR, and you'll find the individual registration links there. Also, the recording links will be posted there upon the completion of each webinar. Please note that we covered the FAR in 2020, so if you're eager to get a jump start, find these historical recordings on our site. Navigate to the Webinars tab and scroll down to the section The FAR 2020. But just because it has been 4 years, many of the regulations have changed and they've been updated, so please use this as a reference tool only. Okay, so a little bit about us. We work with established federal contractors worldwide, helping them to navigate the market. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance, and some of the contract vehicles we support are listed here on your screen. For more information, please visit our website. So those were our services for federal contractors, but we also provide marketing and advertising services for organizations who are selling to federal contractors. We can add some extra muscle to your marketing efforts via our newsletter ads and our webinar sponsorships to in-person events. Please email us and ask for our media kit. Is your business pursuing the Homeland Security contract vehicle and in need of a compliance matrix or a full proposal support? We offer assistance with the DHS PACT contract. Please email us for a quote at hello@jenniferschaus.com. We can also support your business with a proposal help on the upcoming NASA SEWP contract. Again, we offer anything from a compliance matrix to full handholding and proposal support. hello@jenniferschaus.com is the email to use to contact us for help. A little later in June, we'll hear from Carrie Palmatier on small business innovation in federal contracting. Specifically, Carrie will cover information on SBIRs and STTRs. These two options are a great way for tech companies to grow in the federal sector. This is a two-part series, and as always, these are complimentary and recorded, so please join us for that. Our webinars are complimentary and recorded thanks to our longtime and generous corporate and in-kind sponsors. Please allow me to introduce them. We would like to thank our friends over at GovEvents, the premier platform for posting events related to government and government contracting. You can find all of our webinars and our events on govevents.com, as well as recordings from our 600+ webinars in the past. We also want to thank Tom Johnson and his team at Set Aside Alert, the go-to publication for contracting opportunities for small, women-owned, veteran-owned, hub zone, and 8A firms. Visit setasidealert.com for more information. The Fairfax Economic Development Authority has an online calendar of events and webinars, and we want to thank them for posting our events and webinars to their calendar. The Virginia Apex Accelerator at George Mason University offers free one-on-one counseling to established government contracting firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. If you're interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore their services, review homework recommendations, register for live training, and find useful links to agencies and other self-directed learnings. One-on-one counseling is limited to eligible client companies, and appointments are handled in the order they were received and based on counselor availability due to high demand. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. Join the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce's monthly GovCon Council meeting to network with peers, learn about upcoming events and opportunities, and help to shape future programming. The meetings take place the fourth Tuesday of each month at 8:30 a.m. at the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce, and the next meeting will be on Tuesday, April 23rd. The Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce will be hosting its 12th annual NOVA B2G Matchmaking Conference and Small Business Expo on May 2nd in Reston, Virginia. The event includes networking, matchmaking, breakout sessions, and an expo hall, and keynotes from the government and industry. Attendees can schedule one-on-one matchmaking meetings with primes and agencies, and also visit the expo showcasing services to help GovCon succeed. Education sessions will cover the full life cycle of government contracting from proposal creation to compliance. Please visit novab2g.restonchamber.org for more information. Do you want help winning government contracts? BidSpeed can help. Users can find contract opportunities from federal, state, and local government. Additionally, you can search for teaming partners, incumbent point of contacts, expiring contracts, compliance matrices, and also proposal templates. Create your login today at bidspeed.com. BidSpeed is an official partner of the U.S. Small Business Administration's E2G, Empower to Grow. Events are the ultimate engagement channel to bring government and industry together. 68% of government personnel report that they attend more than one event each year. The Federal Business Council, or FBC, has worked with government and industry for 45 plus years to create gatherings where ideas are shared and to help government achieve its goals. This includes agency industry days, cybersecurity symposiums, and technology expos and offsite meetings. FBC provides full lifecycle meeting planning and event management. With over 5,000 meetings under their belt, FBC has the experience, systems, and personnel to make your next event exceptional. Learn more at www.fbcinc.com. Please also check out our friends over at GovBrew. GovBrew is the most read GovCon newsletter, keeping thousands of GovCon professionals in the loop with news, updates, and opportunities in the federal government contracting market. All in a fun and accessible email that only takes 5 minutes to read. It's 100% free to join. It goes out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 a.m., and it's filled with great content, event postings, webinars, and more. We encourage you to sign up at govbrew.co, or you can use the QR code you see on your screen. Okay, now let's meet today's speaker. Please welcome Aqcuisitions to the webinar. Eric, we're honored to have you with us today, and we're so excited to hear your presentation on the FAR. We appreciate the time you took to put together the content. Now I'll put myself on mute and turn the floor over to you. So please let me know when you're ready for your next slide, and I'll just advance them as we discuss.
Thanks, really appreciate it. I appreciate the introduction and be able to talk to the group about FAR Part 22. We can go to the next slide. As you probably could see, I'm a partner at Holland & Knight, and I sit in our government contracts group. So today we're going to talk about FAR Part 22. We could spend a whole day talking about FAR Part 22. It's really extensive. As it says on the slide, it's lengthy. So this is not going to be everything that you'll see in FAR Part 22. That would just take quite a few hours to cover. So what we did is I took out some highlights, some things I thought were most important and most pressing, and we're going to talk through them here. So with that, let's go into FAR Part 22. So what does this part deal with? Well, it's the application of labor laws to government contracts, and that's certainly a sticky area for a lot of contractors. And I like to go to the FAR part itself and see what the FAR part says about itself. So here it says it deals with general policies regarding contractor labor relations as they pertain to acquisitions, contracting policies and procedures, and the different contract clauses with respect to labor laws. So covers the waterfront and labor for government contracts. Next slide. So here's a partial list of the laws that are mentioned or covered by FAR Part 22. You have what other people call QASA, Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act, and then we have Davis-Bacon, which is construction, the Equal Opportunity Laws, Service Contract Labor Standards, formerly known as the Service Contract Act, and then we have the laws that are aimed at helping certain groups, such as veterans and workers with disabilities, combating trafficking in persons. And then we have these bolt-ons that really apply in certain circumstances, the minimum wage for contractors and the paid sick leave. So these are just some of the laws that are covered in FAR Part 22. It's a very substantive part of the FAR, certainly a lot of ground that we could cover in here. Each one of these things can make up a session in and of themselves. But we'll touch on most of the things that you see in this list today. Next slide. So I always like looking at the definitions in the FAR because those definitions kind of trickle through the FAR itself and the part itself, and they really inform what a contractor or an individual reading it, how they should interpret what's going on. So the first one, though, is a really kind of interesting definition, agency labor advisor. And they're the ones who advise the contracting officials at the agency about labor laws, as it says here, federal contract labor matters. It's a great, they can be a great resource for contractors too. They're not there to advise contractors on what to do, but if a contractor is having an issue with the contracting agency as far as they're not implementing the labor laws properly, or they're misinterpreting something, or they're not doing something they're supposed to be doing, an agency labor advisor can really act as a good intermediary. If you are in fact correct, they can speak to the agency contracting officer or something like that and help set them straight. We have to remember these contracting officers, they're in charge of knowing dozens and dozens of laws and rules and regulations and how to implement them. And so it's altogether possible that they don't have as firm a grip on certain labor laws as you might if you kind of specialize in this area or deal with it quite a bit. So these labor advisors are steeped in this stuff, and they're really good at kind of acting as an intermediary sometimes. To find out who the agency labor advisor is, if you go on sam.gov and go in the wage determination section, there is a listing of all the agency labor advisors and their contact information. So really good resource for folks. The second definition I have here is service employee, and this is really applicable to the Service Contract Act, now known as Service Contract Labor Standards, but let's call it SCA for short. These service employees are folks who are not exempt, folks who are working on a contract providing services. And it's, as it says here, it's regardless of any contractual relationship. So just because somebody's a 1099 doesn't mean they're not covered by the Service Contract Act, for instance. They're still covered because their contractual relationship doesn't matter. A little bit more on the SCA in a bit as we can go to the next slide. So what are some general policies that the government's supposed to have with respect to labor policies? And this is not DOL, of course. These are the agencies themselves, right? So the agencies are supposed to be neutral with respect to their relationships between industry and labor. If there's any kind of dispute at all, they're supposed to remain impartial. They're not supposed to mediate disputes. They're not supposed to undergo any kind of conciliation of the disputes or potential disputes. The only thing where they should really be concerned is if any kind of labor issue is going to impact performance. They will and can and have seek some kind of agreement between the parties to allow performance to continue, the acquisition process to continue uninterrupted for those products and services, irrespective of any kind of labor dispute. So what their interest is preserving performance on the contract, getting what they paid for without respect to whether the labor dispute is, if there is some kind of labor dispute, is going to impact that. Let's go to the next slide. So first policy we're going to talk about here, and I have the references at the top, as you can see, overtime, FAR Part 22.103. And this kind of defines what overtime is. It's not the same across the country. For instance, California has a different definition of overtime, but for purposes of the FAR, overtime is any time that exceeds 40 hours a week. If it's outside the U.S., you kind of look to the local norms to see what is considered overtime. Government does not want to pay for overtime as a default. Their acquisition planning. In their acquisition planning, they're going to try to provide for contracts that don't require overtime. So enough of a runway or enough people on the contract, so overtime is not required. So they want contractors to avoid using overtime when they can. So that's what that subsection B says. And they don't want schedules that include overtime when solicitations come out. So, the government is actively looking to see if certain schedules are requiring overtime or certain offers would be contingent on overtime being part of it. And if they determine that it is, they will seek to kind of renegotiate taking out the overtime as or seek offers from other sources. So they don't want to pay for overtime. Now there might be some. You go to the next slide. Thank you. There may be some instances where overtime is more economical than not having overtime. So you could see that sometimes agencies will approve that. But if you look at kind of the language in FAR subpart 22.103, they really don't want to pay for overtime. So you could see in sub A, if there is overtime that's going to be contemplated or necessary, the agency wants to get an offer that accounts for all of that. They want to see what it is up front. Sometimes overtime can make up for delays when that delay is not the contractor's fault. So if the agency did something or stopped work, or maybe there was a shutdown of some kind and that caused the deadlines to fall, and the deadlines can't fall, so overtime is necessary, then overtime may be approved under circumstances like that. But they won't approve it if the contractor has fallen behind on its own accord or its subcontractor's accord. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So that's overtime. Next up for bids is the Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act, FAR 22.3. This is a certain law that kind of overlays on top of, for instance, the Service Contract Act and the Davis-Bacon Act at times. So you can see it's applicable to laborers and mechanics. And this quote kind of lays out the different laborers and mechanics, apprentices, trainees, helpers, watchmen, guards, firefighters, fire guards, and workmen. This is a little bit different as it requires overtime, time and a half of the basic pay. And if a contractor fails to provide overtime to an employee, they're subject to overtime pay for the workers and liquidated damages to the government. Really see this a lot kind of with respect to Service Contract Act. Like if there's an SCA violation and there are and the contract is for guard services, for instance, there's often going to be a QASA violation too. It just kind of one goes with the other oftentimes. So you'll have the liquidated damages, you have the back wages and benefits from SCA, the back overtime, and it kind of compounds upon itself. We go to the next slide. So QASA is not applicable for contracts under $150,000 or if they're performed outside the United States, very similar to Service Contract Act. DOL has the power to investigate violations of this law, and penalties can include debarment if a contractor has violated this law as well. Next slide. So here we have a big one, Davis-Bacon as it's called. They call labor standards for contracts involving construction. You can see it's applicable for contracts valued at $2,000 or more if for the construction, alteration, or repair of public buildings and public works. So, I mean, this $2,000 kind of minimum is pretty meaningless because most contracts are worth far greater than $2,000, of course. At least no client is bringing a contract to me that's under $2,000 with issues. So what does construction, alteration, or repair mean? So I pulled this from the regulations themselves. You can see it's a really wide swath of different tasks, altering, remodel, installation of items that were fabricated off-site, painting and decorating, manufacturing or furnishing of materials for the building, transportation of materials and supplies between the site of the work, or transportation of portions of the building or work between a secondary site where a significant portion of the building or work is constructed. So they really have a definition that's fairly broad to allow for the majority of workers who are working at construction sites to be covered. Next slide. So then it's a building or public work. So what is a building or public work? Public building or public work. This has been the subject of a lot of litigation in general, so it's not always a clear-cut case on what is covered by the Davis-Bacon Act. But you could see here the definition is fairly broad in itself, and a lot of courts have relied on this definition to have a pretty broad overview of what is covered by Davis-Bacon. But it's a building or work that is carried directly by the authority or with funds of a federal agency to serve the interest of the public, regardless of whether the title is in the federal agency of the building or public work. There was a big case in DC, the City Center case, where there was a lot of litigation over that very issue because City Center, it's a private building, but it's built on DC land, and Washington, DC is also covered by the Davis-Bacon Act. So if you have a few hours and you have some free time and you're interested in this area, I would read the cases that came out on City Center in DC. If you're looking for wage determinations, because wage determinations, folks have to be paid in accordance with the Davis-Bacon Act wage determination, those wage determinations are available on sam.gov. So you go to sam.gov and look them up. They're all available for your review. Next slide. And of course, just as big or important as the Davis-Bacon Act is the Service Contract Act, formerly known, well, what was known as the Service Contract Act, now known as the Service Contract Labor Standards. And like the Davis-Bacon Act, the value has to be pretty low in order for it to be just $2,500 or more. There was a move in Congress afoot about potentially raising those limits to somewhere in the millions. In fact, the Section 809 panel, which was aimed at acquisition reform, recommended raising the limits for Davis-Bacon and Service Contract Act to somewhere in the millions. That never really went anywhere, so I don't anticipate that we'll see that. In effect, every contract, regardless of dollar value, are covered by these things because very few contracts are awarded for less than $2,500 or $2,000, SCA, DBA, respectively. So under the Service Contract Act, you could have collective bargaining agreements that are used as the wage determination. Those can be challenged by a third party if they're not the result of arm's length negotiations or if they're at variance with the locality. If you're inheriting a contract that had a CBA in it, you're not obligated to sign a CBA with the union, but you do have to honor the financial requirements of that existing CBA. That becomes the wage determination. Next slide. Just to level set on the Service Contract Act, what is required? This isn't exactly spelled out clearly in the regulations, but I thought I'd throw this in here because a lot of people have this question. Wages in accordance with the inappropriate wage determination. Then also in the wage determination, the benefits, there are three kinds of benefits. There's the health and welfare benefit that changes on an annual basis. There's the vacation benefit, and there are the holiday benefits. They all have particular requirements and pitfalls associated with them. The third thing that's required under the SCA is notification to employees of their SCA status and what labor category they're in. Regulations spell out exactly what that notification looks like. And then there's a record keeping requirement that contractors have to keep records for a certain period of time. DOL typically will review compliance going back 2 to 3 years, depending on the seriousness, but there's nothing that prevents them from looking back longer. Next slide. So what are some pitfalls under the Service Contract Labor Standards to think about? These are so I do a bunch of SCA work, and these are the kind of the common things that I see. One is folks working in different labor categories without a new wage. So, the program managers are all about getting, project managers, all about getting the job done. Somebody doesn't show up to work, they take somebody else, shuffle them into that position. That position maybe has a higher wage rate. So that person may be entitled to that new wage rate for the week or for the day. If they're within a family, so if it's within a family, like you're going from cook 1 to cook 2, then that higher wage rate is applicable for the entire week. If you're just going from like an accountant 1 to cook 2, which would be an unusual switch, but maybe the person has multiple talents, you could confine that change to just the, you could track those hours and confine the change to those hours that you're tracking. So just something to think about under the SCA. Also unpaid working time, preliminary time. That's been an issue that's been up and down at the Supreme Court. Just be careful, folks, that they're getting paid for time where they are engaged to wait. Also, that if they're off, they're actually off and not having to keep vigilance or something like that. And then the third issue is prime subcompliance. That's a big area under the Service Contract Act. Because prime contractors are jointly and severally liable for their subcontractors' malfeasance, misconduct. And under those circumstances, prime contractors want to have prime sub-agreements that really lock the subcontractor in having to pay those back wages, because DOL can go to the prime contractor if the sub is unwilling to pay. So if you're a prime contractor, you want your subcontract agreement to say that if DOL comes a knocking, subcontractor is responsible for paying those back wages, whether they agree with the disposition or not, because the prime contractor doesn't want to have to collect, you have to pay those out after they've paid the subcontractor, of course. And then you have GSA schedule compliance. GSA schedules provide kind of a more difficult scenario oftentimes for SCA compliance because every wage termination is in the GSA schedule contract. So normally under normal circumstances, what happens is you have a contract, the contracting officer will attach a wage termination to the solicitation or to the contract that informs which wages and benefits have to be paid to those workers. With GSA, they're all attached. So it's up to the contractor to figure that out. Also, you have the issue where your GSA schedule rates for an individual may be higher than what the wage, may be different than what the wage termination permits. So for instance, if you have a wage termination that's requiring $30 an hour for a certain kind of worker and your GSA schedule labor rate is $25 an hour, you can't charge the government more than the $25 an hour, so you lose money on each one of those workers. So just be careful when working within the confines of a GSA schedule. And then another pitfall I see a lot is pricing impact. A lot of folks bid on these contracts that are covered by the Service Contract Act without realizing the pricing impact that these wages and benefits have. So whoever is drafting the bids and figuring out the prices for those bids should be well versed in the Service Contract Act to understand the potential pitfalls and cost implications of a Service Contract Act contract. Next slide. There are exemptions for the Service Contract Act. This is not a list of all of them. I will say we could do a whole hour-long session on the exemptions for the Service Contract Act. I won't do that to you. It's a Friday and the weather's not so bad. But here are some really ones that are more common. Contracts for construction, because they're covered by the Davis-Bacon Act. Common carrier transportation, where there are tariff rates. So that's for goods or for people. Contracts for public utilities. If there's a direct service to the federal agency, so a federal agency is hiring X person to do a certain job. And then you have contracts for the maintenance, calibration, or repair of certain equipment under certain circumstances. For certain equipment, there's a requirement that the manufacturer or supplier be the one who does the maintenance, calibration, or repair. So the exemptions are really hard to get under the Service Contract Act, so you really have to do a careful analysis to make sure that there is an exemption that you can utilize. Next slide. So here are some important FAR clauses just to keep in mind. Outside of Part 22, under the Service Contract Act, the basic clause 52222-41, and then the price adjustments clause, which should always be in there if the Service Contract Act clause is in there, because when you get a new wage determination, you are entitled to a price adjustment under these clauses. The -43 which is far more common because it's for multiple year contracts with options. -44 if it's a single year contract without any options at all. Next slide. So I put this in here because it's a big issue that I've seen recently pop up, especially under FAR 22.1009. So a lot of folks have Service Contract Act type contracts, which this wasn't a norm earlier, but where people are working from home remotely. They hire people around the country to work on these contracts, especially like call center contracts and things like that. And it doesn't face the reality of the wage determination. So if you have a contract where you get a wage determination for somewhere in Mississippi, for instance, but you decide to hire people from around the country, you don't have wage determinations for all those people. So this section kind of talks to that process and what happens under this process. So initially, if contracting officers should try to determine where that place of performance is going to be and use that determination to put various wage determinations in the solicitation itself to make people aware. Now, they may not figure out all those places of potential performance. So contractors do have an opportunity within a certain period of time to request additional places in writing from the contracting officer and to include those wage determinations in the solicitation itself. The downside is, let's say that happens and you win a contract and you hire a bunch of folks who are not in the locality of where the original wage determinations were. So you hire a bunch of people in Alaska, for instance, to do call center work. And those folks, there was no Alaskan based wage determination. Well, you could still go to the contracting officer. They'll still incorporate the new wage determination in the contract, but you will not be entitled to a price adjustment. So if you have to pay those folks more, you won't get a price adjustment from the agency for those higher wages. Normally, if a new wage determination does come in the contract, there is as we mentioned on the last slide, there's a price adjustment that you're entitled to. Under the circumstances here, there's no entitlement to the price adjustment. So if you are hiring remote workers to work on SCA type contracts, which is fairly common these days, make sure that the wage determination was in the contract already or in a solicitation, or if it's not a higher wage rate than you've already been prepared to pay under the other wage determinations. Next slide. So another thing about the Service Contract Act, not dissimilar to Davis-Bacon, is that there can be a withhold of contract payments. So the contracting agency can withhold contract payments, or DOL can require it if there is an allegation of underpayment to employees. It doesn't have to be a firm conclusion of that occurring, by the way. It just could be an allegation. You typically see this when a contract especially is winding down and the DOL is concerned that it won't have a method to collect the back wages. It then requires a withhold to ensure there's enough of a reservoir there to cover the back wages that are alleged to be owed. Also, agencies can terminate a contractor for default for violating the Service Contract Act. And the Department of Labor does have the power to debar contractors for 3 years if they violate the Service Contract Act. In fact, it's a strict liability statute the way it's written, although in practice it's not like this. But it's written in that if you do violate the SCA, you are required to be debarred for 3 years. Now, that was a standard that Congress put in years ago because they thought this would be a very easy statute to comply with. In reality, it's not that easy to comply with. So DOL has taken a more lenient approach and really looks to debar contractors that have had multiple violations or really serious violations that demonstrate kind of a lack of integrity. But that being said, DOL is made up of individuals, so you never know what's going to happen. And they do have the right and sometimes will seek debarment for a first-time offense. Next slide. So here are some other regulations of interest in this FAR part. So we have equal opportunity for veterans. Veterans are required to be treated fairly. And in fact, the government really encourages contractors to go out and seek veterans for positions to work on contracts. So it's supposed to list employment opportunities with appropriate organizations that can find veterans to do the work. They should take affirmative action to employ veterans and not discriminate veterans, particularly disabled veterans. There should be outreach to veterans and veterans groups in order to find veterans to work on these contracts. And contractors are required to find benchmarks and goals and establish goals for hiring veterans as well. Next slide. Then we have workers with disabilities, very similar kind of idea. FAR 22.14, contractors must take affirmative action and treat folks with disabilities without discrimination. Again, outreach to try to hire folks with disabilities and look at utilization of individuals with disabilities versus folks without disabilities and make sure that they're meeting their goals to do so. Next slide. Then we have a really important policy. This is relatively on the newer side, combating trafficking in persons, and contractors are required to have a policy to prohibit contractors, their employees, subcontractors, their employees, and their agents from engaging in trafficking during the performance of the contract, or procuring commercial sex acts, using forced labor. General term here that I put in, interfering with an employee's identification or immigration documents, so not taking it and holding it from them, things like that. Big problem overseas at times. Any kind of misleading or fraudulent practices during the recruitment process, or recruiters who are not complying with the with rules and regulations, and recruitment fees, avoiding, prohibiting the charging of employees and prospective employees with recruitment fees in order to find a job. Next slide. We have a couple of newer kind of things here, relatively newer. The first is the minimum wage for contractors. There are FAR Part 52 clauses that institute these into contracts, but it's also resides here. The policies reside here in FAR Part 22. This is 22.19. We had a minimum wage requirement under the Obama administration. It's now, there's now another one under the Biden administration that's a little bit higher. It started at $15 an hour back in 2022. It's adjusted annually, and it's gone up every year. So it's higher than that now. You'll find the latest number in the applicable wage determination that's applicable to your contract. It's applicable for a Service Contract Act and Davis-Bacon Act construction contracts. I will say the implementation of this is far more complicated than you'd think at first glance, because you have some contracts where you might have the old clause versus the new clause, minimum wage clause in it. DOL's position is that you have to pay the new one. I'm not so sure legally if that stands up, but that's their position. So you just want to look at your particular situation and what's appropriate. Of course, you want to keep the agency informed to make sure that, because there is a price adjustments clause within the minimum wage clause in the FAR Part 52 clause. You want to be able to get entitlement to those price adjustments for the increased wages. So just be careful about that. And then there are, this is not applicable for exempt employees. And like with everything else, the contractual relationship doesn't matter if the person's a 1099, they're still covered by this. So the minimum wage is applicable whether they're an employee or not, as long as they're doing the work, they're working for you. Next slide. So, and then the other thing is that's a little less new, but still pretty new, is establishing paid sick leave for federal contractors, which requires 1 hour of paid sick leave for every 30 hours of work. This is really interesting. The second one, the lack of a safe harbor, as I put it here. There are a lot of localities that have sick leave laws. They're not exactly consistent with the sick leave FAR clause. So in those instances, you want to kind of look and compare. And DOL's position is that you utilize the one that's more generous, because if you utilize the one that's more generous, it covers both of them. So if you have multiple sick leave laws covered by the same worker, an analysis has to be done to figure out which one is being utilized in order to make sure you're compliant with both. If a worker spends less than 20% of their time on federal contracts in general, so they're like a general office employee, and they're not working on federal contracts, so they're not working in conjunction with the federal contract, then they wouldn't be covered by this. I will say for this requirement and the minimum wage requirement, it's not just the folks who are billing to the contract, but there are folks who are supporting contracts too who could be covered by this. And that's where that 20% rule comes in. So if you have a billing clerk, for instance, that sends out bills for federal contracts, invoices and stuff like that, but they only do it for 5% of their time, they're not going to be covered by this. But if they do it half the time, they will be. So just, that requires careful analysis. The sick leave that's unused is not required to be paid out upon departure. Doesn't say this in the slide, but if they come back within a year, it has to be restored to them. If you voluntarily pay out the sick leave when they do leave and they come back within a year, you don't have to restore the sick leave because you've already paid it out to them. So just something to keep in mind. Next slide. All right, with that, I will pass it on back to you.
Thank you so much, Eric, for a very informative presentation, and thanks to everybody who joined us today also. As mentioned, you can always catch the recordings on our YouTube channel within 24 hours and find over 600 webinars on government contracting there. And that's it for today's webinar. Thank you again, Eric, and thank you to everybody else who joined us today. Have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend.
Thanks.